During the 5th generation of consoles, Sony entered into gaming, delivering a console that changed the industry. Fueled by the rejection of both Nintendo and Sega, Sony created the PlayStation, which massively outsold the competition and earned Sony the support of a wide range of developers who created an expansive selection of games for the system. However, with the 6th generation looming on the horizon, many began to wonder if Sony could really take the lead in another generation, as Nintendo and Sega were fiercely planning to try and get back on top. However, this generation, they wouldn't be Sony's only competition, as tech juggernaut Microsoft were now planning to expand from the PC market and launch their first home console, the Xbox. All eyes were on Sony, as fan expectations had never been higher, and the competition had never been fiercer. But Sony weren't ready to back down, as they were planning to challenge the standards of game design by creating a console that would be an entirely different beast. However, after earning the goodwill of developers in the last generation, the PS2 would pose greater challenges to game developers.
The PS2 era was interesting because it was very difficult for a lot of people. It was survival. We loved PlayStation, but we had to figure out how to pay for it. And I began to see the designer in a different light. Ken Kutaragi. Why? He changed the industry, he changed this. And I said, he put half of the development community out of business.
While the original PlayStation had shaken the games industry, with the PlayStation 2, Sony was aiming to change the entire entertainment world. The PlayStation 1 had been a massive success for Sony, becoming the first home console in history to sell over 100 million units, an impressive feat for Sony's first entry into the industry. This level of success was incredibly surprising, as the titans of the industry, Nintendo and Sega, already had a strong and dedicated following, as well as a number of highly regarded exclusive game series. But the PlayStation still managed to massively outpace the rest of the industry. Ken Kutaragi was the father of the PlayStation, and it had been his mission to break Sony into the gaming market, which led to 2 failed attempts to collaborate with Nintendo and Sega, after which Sony felt slighted by the fruitless endeavors, and Kutaragi was given the full backing of Sony so he could leverage every asset at the company's disposal to create a console that developers, publishers, and consumers would all flock to. By having the system being competitively priced, easy to develop for, and also having fairer distribution rights when compared to the rest of the industry. This approach led to Sony having a massive amount of support from third-party developers, and even allowed them to snag the previously Nintendo-exclusive Final Fantasy series over to the PlayStation. It was clear that Sony strongly believed in the PlayStation's future, as back in 1994, Ken Kutaragi had reportedly began working on the concept for the PS2 around the launch of the original PlayStation. However, even as the PS1 went on to become a massive success, the development of the PS2 was kept quiet and not revealed to the public or media for some time, presumably to keep the focus on the PS1. But as the original PlayStation had set such a high bar, there was definitely a degree of trepidation about following up the console. Going into PlayStation 2, we were certainly confident, but we were also cautious, because it was very rare that the leader of one generation could hold that position in the next. There was a great deal of trepidation not to get caught up in our success, and make sure that we redoubled our efforts going into the next generation. As the console's development was such a closely guarded secret, little is actually known about the development process. However, in early 1997, rumors started to leak out about the system and how it would have a DVD drive, internet capabilities, as well as backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1. However, Phil Harrison would go on to try and quell the rumors in an interview in January 1998, where he would reassure consumers that they were still focused on supporting the PlayStation 1. As he stated, "There's nothing to suggest in any future, near or medium term, that PlayStation is going to run out of steam, so we're not even considering a next generation at this time." While the PS1 continued to see strong sales, Sega was licking its wounds from the last generation, as the Sega Saturn had been vastly outsold by the competition. So Sega was once again keen to get an early lead on the competition, as in May 1998 the Sega Dreamcast was revealed, and it appeared to boast some impressive specifications, visuals, and some innovative features that drew the attention of the games media, with one of the most bizarre technical demos that I've ever seen, featuring the president of Sega, Shinichiro Arimajiri.
こんにちは、入間尻です。こんなこともできます。ドリームキャストです。セガは変わります。それでは皆さんごきげんよう。
Mum, get your wallet now. Alongside the console's reveal, Sega announced that they were planning to kick off the next generation earlier than expected, as they planned to launch the Dreamcast in Japan during November of that very same year, with an American and European launches following in autumn of 1999. Sega was aggressively pushing to make an impact before anyone else could get to market. However, Sony was unshaken by the announcement and remained tight-lipped about their next-generation console, as Sega's aggressive strategy hadn't served them well with the Saturn, which, while it was still seeing games released, it had actually been discontinued in North America and Europe the very same year, while the PlayStation's demand continued to grow, selling 21.6 million systems in 1998 alone, and the console still was seeing a steady lineup of landmark titles launching on the system. So remaining confident, Sony would continue to quietly work on their next-generation PlayStation until the 2nd of March the following year, when Sony would host the PlayStation Meeting 1999 in Tokyo, where they would finally reveal what they had been working on for the next generation, announcing the specifications of the system, revealing that the console would feature backwards compatibility, and showcasing some early tech demos displaying some incredibly impressive visuals running in real time. In particular, the ballroom scene from Final Fantasy VIII impressed many, because in the original game on PS1, this scene was only possible as a pre-rendered full-motion video, and what's more impressive is that the developers who created these demos had done so in roughly 1 week, as they had just received early development kits. Also at the event, Sony revealed that gamers wouldn't have to wait too long to see more of the console, as they revealed a tentative release date for its initial Japanese launch of March 2000, just 1 year after this initial reveal. Later that month in the US, Phil Harrison would attend the Game Developers Conference and give a comprehensive breakdown of the new PlayStation console's capabilities and specifications directly to Western game developers and the games media. He also discussed how Ken Kutaragi and his team had created a unique CPU architecture that could outperform high-end PCs of the time. Harrison went on to explain how Sony felt this increase in technological power could have the power to boost the computer entertainment market to the same heights as the music and film industry, stating that this generation would enable developers to create even more captivating experiences than ever before. Just a few months later, at E3 1999, Sony would display the PlayStation 2's tech demos at an interesting pyramid-style kiosk. However, it was clear that they wanted to keep the focus on upcoming titles for the PS1, as they didn't release any new information about the upcoming console. At E3, Nintendo took a similar approach to Sony, announcing their next-generation console, the Dolphin, but mainly focusing on upcoming games for the Nintendo 64 and Game Boy Color. Sega's next generation, however, had a strong presence at E3, as the Dreamcast had launched in Japan the year prior, and was preparing to launch in the West in just a few months, and was turning heads with some impressive playable demos, such as Sonic Adventure, Shenmue, and more. While the Japanese launch had been shaky due to chip supply issues and a lack of games, Sega were sure that they would make a bigger impact launching in the West, as they would have more titles available and a reduced price for the console to entice gamers. So it seemed that it would be a while until Sega would see any competition for this next generation. However, just a few days after the Dreamcast's Western launch, Sony was finally ready to unveil their next generation console at the Tokyo Game Show, where they officially titled the console as the PlayStation 2, announcing the Japanese release date and the standard price of 39,800 yen. Also at the event, it was confirmed that the PS2 would be backwards compatible with PlayStation 1 games and hardware, and would also have the ability to play DVDs, a key feature that the Dreamcast lacked. While the pricing was quite high compared to the competition, the list of features that the console offered made it clear that the PS2 would be the choice for many in this upcoming generation. And the decent selection of playable and visual demos on the show floor showed the press and public that this generation was about to be a massive step forward. But one thing that really intrigued many was right at the heart of the console, with its custom Emotion Engine CPU chip, which Sony claimed was the key to taking the games industry to a whole new level. The idea Kutaragi and his team of engineers established was that the CPU would be capable of not just number crunching, but delivering the kind of mathematical capability required to simulate emotion. However, even during its development, this chip would prove to be contentious in the industry, as in 2019, Jez-san, founder of Argonaut Games, revealed that Sony had posed a challenge to select chip manufacturers, asking them to design a rendering chip for their next system. Argonaut Games were well positioned to make a chip, as they had made a name for themselves by creating the revolutionary Super FX chip for the Super Nintendo, which had enabled games that included the chip on the cartridge to have more advanced graphical effects, and could render 3D polygons in-game, which, while primitive by today's standards, was incredibly impressive to see running on the Super Nintendo in 1993. So when Argonaut started working for LSI Logic, who had manufactured chips for the original PlayStation, they found themselves in the perfect position to make a bid for the PS2's chip. So LSI gave the specs of what Sony had asked for, and Argonaut got to work on designing the chip. Once they had finished their prototype, the Argonaut team felt so confident that they had nailed their design, they started to have some fun with the codename. It was something rude, it was either Tadger or Todger, but it was something like that, because it was the dog's bollocks. It was the fastest chip that we knew anyone had ever designed. It would beat anything else that we were aware of. However, much to the team's surprise, Sony didn't go with Argonaut's chip, and were instead opting to use their very own custom design, which they were even planning to manufacture themselves. And also, the specifications that Sony was working with was much faster than what LSI had told Argonaut initially. To this day, it's still unclear how the situation came about, whether it was a miscommunication somewhere along the line between the three companies, or if Sony had other intentions, such as releasing weaker specs to mislead the competition, in the case that the information leaked. Or perhaps due to the company's structure, the team behind the console had to show that they had at least explored options outside of Sony's own design labs. However, ultimately, Sony formed a separate company with Toshiba, based in Nagasaki, to manufacture their custom chips. By doing this, Sony would be able to keep their costs down and also have full control over the manufacturing process, as they wanted to avoid any supply issues at launch, like Sega had experienced during the launch of the Dreamcast. The PlayStation brand now had the full backing of Sony, as they had completely committed to make the PlayStation 2 the must-buy console of the generation, doing everything in their power to make it stand out from the competition. And from the early tech demos and previews, you could see that this next generation would be a massive leap forwards in terms of rendering power, and Sony attributed all of this down to the Emotion Engine. However, while Sony lauded its newest innovation as a breakthrough for the industry, it was a radical departure in terms of system architecture, which would prove to be controversial with developers. Sony's intent when designing the PlayStation 2 was to make sure that every aspect would stand out from the competition, including the console's appearance, which Sony wanted to look immediately captivating and unique, while still feeling distinctly on brand for PlayStation. While the design would echo some characteristics of the original PlayStation, the PS2 had its own distinctive look, as an imposing black monolith, highlighted with pops of a distinctive cosmic blue, which made the console feel modern, minimalistic, and mysterious. The PlayStation art director Teyu Goto conceptualized the design around existence itself, with the blue representing our planet and the dark black representing the infinite expanse of space. PlayStation 2's real-time graphics have no limitations. That's why I chose the color black, as it represents the infinity of the universe. The blue represents the intelligence and light spouting up. The console was designed so it could be stood either vertically or horizontally, and the PlayStation logo on the front could even be rotated to match either orientation. The console's distinctive shape was apparently heavily inspired by an abandoned Atari prototype PC design, named the Atari Falcon Microbox 030, as the system is cited in the PlayStation 2's design patent. The early concept for the PlayStation 2 was to make it a multimedia system as well as a games console, as it would support a new multimedia CD format that Sony had co-created with Philips, called DVD, which first launched in Japan in 1996. DVD stands for Digital Video Disc, or Digital Versatile Disc, and the format offered a massive increase in storage size compared to CDs, as standard DVDs could offer up to 4.7 gigabytes, compared to the 700 megabytes of a typical CD. Games for the PlayStation 2 could be printed on either CDs or DVDs, depending on how much storage the game required. Games printed on CD would have a distinctive blue back, while games on DVDs would have a silver back. And some games would use a special dual-layered disc which would have a light gold appearance and offer up to 8.5 gigabytes of storage. With the larger storage space that DVDs would offer, this meant that game assets could be bigger and higher quality. Alongside the new console, Sony also introduced a new controller, the DualShock 2, which looked almost identical to the original DualShock, aside from its new default black color. However, it hosts some changes internally, as the face and shoulder buttons are now pressure sensitive and can sense 256 levels of pressure, so that button inputs can be read as an analog value. Due to its similarity to the original DualShock, the PS1 is actually forwards compatible with the DualShock 2, so the new controller can be used with the older console. The PS2 also features extensive backwards compatibility with the PlayStation 1, so it's able to play PlayStation 1 games as well as use accessories from the system like the original DualShock, multi-tap, and memory cards. And the DualShock 1 can also be used to play many PlayStation 2 games. However, not all games would be compatible, especially ones that made use of the DualShock 2's pressure-sensitive buttons. This extensive support of the previous generation meant that players who had already invested in the PlayStation ecosystem would be able to sell their original PlayStation console and bring across their existing library of games, saves, and accessories. The PS2 hosted a number of forward-thinking features, as it was the first games console that was able to output digital audio via an optical connector, which had become the standard for home theater setups. Also, the console had support for component cables that could be used on HD displays, and a few games for the system could even output at the resolution of 1080i. The original PS2 designs released in Japan were built with a slot for a PCMCIA card, which had an Ethernet port for online features, as well as a port for the official PS2 hard drive accessory. However, for the international release, the design was changed to feature an expansion bay that had space for a 3.5-inch hard drive to be inserted into the console, which could be connected to the PlayStation by using the network adapter peripheral. This peripheral would now enable the PlayStation for online play, and also the ability to install large games onto the hard drive and download updates and expansions through the internet. An incredibly forward-thinking feature that would only become standard with the 7th generation of consoles. Also, the network adapter and hard drive would also give users the ability to install and run Linux on the PlayStation 2, so the console could effectively be used as a personal computer. Exclusively in Japan, consoles that had the network adapter and hard drive could install an upgraded PS2 firmware, known as the PlayStation Broadband Navigator, or PSBBN, which unlocked even more features for the PS2, allowing users to browse online channels filled with news updates about games and peripherals for the system, as well as download videos and game demos, and also some full games. Users could also store their game saves directly on the hard drive. The PSBBN firmware allowed the console to operate as a multimedia device, as it could also rip audio CDs and store songs on the hard drive, and in the earlier versions of the software, you could also check out tracks from the console to a mini-disc player. However, this feature was removed in later versions of the firmware due to piracy concerns, as although you could only check out tracks a limited number of times, users found a simple way to circumvent these restrictions. In addition to ripping CDs, users could also transfer photos from digital cameras. Also, users could check their email and even browse the internet. And on top of all of these features, the PlayStation 2 also offered DVD playback, offering up to many an affordable entry point into the latest innovation in home video. The console was shaping up to be a multimedia beast, and was also promising to deliver some of the most visually impressive games seen so far on a console. It seemed like a console unlike anything the industry had seen so far, and what powered the system was anything but typical. At the heart of the console is Sony's in-house developed CPU, known as the Emotion Engine, which featured an incredibly unique architecture, as it's comprised of 8 separate units, which are designed to handle specific tasks and are all grouped together on the same die. These units included a 64-bit MIPS CPU core, clocked at 294 MHz, integrated with 24 KB of L1 cache memory, as well as 16 KB of scratchpad fast RAM. The CPU was tightly coupled with 2 128-bit vector processing units, known as VPU-0 and VPU-1, which would handle polygon and geometry transformations. Also an IPU, or Image Processing Unit, used for MPEG-2 image decoding, enabling the playback of DVDs and in-game full-motion videos, as well as the vector quantization of 2D graphics data, and also the DMAC, which was a custom-developed chip that was built to optimize data flow as it connected to the 32 MB of RD RAM and could move data around at extremely fast rates. The Emotion Engine as a whole would calculate all of the graphics data needed to generate a frame, and then would pass those instructions to the graphics synthesizer chip, which would in turn render that data. The graphics synthesizer chip, also known as the GS, is a custom-built GPU built with 16 parallel processors clocked at 147 MHz, coupled with 4 MB of DRAM. The IPO chip processes all of the inputs and outputs from controllers and USB connections. Whilst this chip already has an integral task, it also serves another function, as it's actually a duplicate of the R3000 CPU chip used as the CPU in the original PlayStation, and is what enabled the PS2 to run PlayStation 1 games. So effectively, when a PlayStation 1 game was inserted into the PlayStation 2, the CPU would switch over to this chip, so that games would be run on the same processor as the PlayStation 1 for hardware-based backwards compatibility. The PlayStation 2's architecture was innovative but complex, as Sony's main focus with the PS2 was making the system's rendering as fast as possible, as they felt that the PS1 was well behind the competition in terms of fill rate. So the PlayStation 2's architecture was designed primarily to move large amounts of data around the system as quickly as possible. However, this meant that developers would have to completely change their approach when working with the PlayStation 2 to consistently utilize all of the PS2's coprocessors by feeding them a consistent stream of data, rather than their usual approach of storing data in a system's cache. Instead, the Emotion Engine's vector processing units were designed with parallel processing in mind, so the CPU and VPUs could all work in tandem to handle different tasks at the same time. And while the system lacked a large cache of VRAM to hold data in storage, it was far ahead of the competition in terms of fill rate, as it offered somewhere around 1.2 gigapixels thanks to the powerful GS chip and how the Emotion Engine could efficiently schedule rendering commands and feed them directly to the GS, which meant that the system was capable of some impressive feats of computer processing. This leaner approach to processing initially was hard for developers to adapt to, and also developers argued that Sony didn't help developers to make the most of the system, as some developers reported that the development kits supplied by Sony ahead of launch were quite primitive, and the provided documentation was messy and did little to help understand how to develop for the system's complex architecture. Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, even stated in an interview 2 days before the launch of the PlayStation 2 that the system was harder to develop for than the notoriously complex Sega Saturn. Another Japanese developer who wished to remain anonymous also added, "Sony provided an extensive library with PlayStation. The library would do a lot of work, but with the PS2, there is no library. We need to create our own library, which poses its own set of problems, in that there are so many choices to achieve the same effects." It was becoming clear that Sony's new approach was a massive change for developers, and their reluctance to even help them to utilize their system didn't sit well with many, as it meant that development would be more expensive as they would have to spend their own time and resources trying to learn how to program for the system. Lorne Lanning, the creator of the Oddworld series, which had previously been successful on the PlayStation, was initially developing the third game in the series for the PlayStation 2. However, with the rising cost of development for the PS2, their publisher decided to look at moving the game over to competing platforms. Even after developers voiced their concerns about the PlayStation 2's architecture, Ken Kutaragi firmly believed that this new innovative approach would offer a new challenge to developers and would inspire them to master this architecture so that they could fully utilize its capabilities and push the system to its limits, enabling them to create new innovative gaming experiences that would push the boundaries of interactive entertainment. While Sony was committed to this direction, it was an undeniably risky move for any console to go against the established norms of the industry. However, with the first PlayStation, Sony had managed to establish a strong foothold in the gaming industry and had earned a lot of goodwill with both gamers and developers. So when many developers saw the capabilities of the system, they were happy to take on the challenge. One such developer was Hideo Kojima, who was feverishly preparing to reveal the latest entry into the Metal Gear series, with Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, during E3 of 2000, as the PS2 was still a few months away from launching in the US. At this point, developers were still figuring out how to utilize the hardware, and Kojima was nervous about how his title would compare to others. Honestly, we had no idea what other companies were doing for the PS2. We weren't very confident about how we should present our visuals, especially since we put more focus on the environment and the effects than the number of polygons in the characters. I was just so scared because I didn't know what the new Resident Evil or Final Fantasy or Tomb Raider games were going to look like. However, his concerns were quickly put to rest when E3 rolled around and the trailer was shown to an audience, and the response was incredible. People were absolutely blown away by what they were seeing, as the trailer showcased the game's incredibly impressive visuals, detailed environments and effects that would affect gameplay, such as real-time shadows being used to track enemies around corners, and environments reacting to bullets, and every part of the game was displayed with Kojima's cinematic flair. While the PlayStation 2's early game previews had already been impressive, Metal Gear Solid 2 proved that the PlayStation 2 was capable of taking gaming to a whole new level, as the MGS2 showcase at E3 sparked the imagination of gamers with an absolutely electric response.
It was incredible. It was unbelievable, mind-blowing. I can't wait.
Kojima and TV did an awesome job. It's reason to buy PlayStation 2 alone.
It's just lovely. I mean, wow.
As the games industry felt like the boundaries were truly being pushed to a whole new level, as finally the interactive media of games could stand shoulder to shoulder with the greats of cinema. However, with the release of MGS2 still over a year away, the 6th generation of consoles was beginning to kick into high gear, as the Sega Dreamcast was already hitting store shelves, and Nintendo preparing their next console, now titled the GameCube, as well as a new dark horse joining the console race, as tech giant Microsoft would be bringing their years of experience with the PC market to this new generation, with their first home console, the Xbox, boasting greater specs than any other system on the market. While Sony had built an impressive system on paper that promised an extensive list of features and some incredibly impressive games, the gaming market had more competition than ever, and now it was finally time to see if they could deliver on what they had promised, and if the PlayStation brand could lead the next generation once again. The PlayStation 2 was slated to first launch in Japan on March 4th, 2000 at a price of 39,800 yen. However, Sega had managed to have the first 6th generation console on the market, as the Sega Dreamcast had already launched well over a year before the PlayStation 2 at a lower price point of 29,000 yen, where it had sold out of its entire stock on its launch day alone. However, while this appeared to be a strong launch, the Dreamcast was actually struggling to gain much of a foothold in the Japanese market, as they had issues with chip supplies and manufacturing, so they had launched with a limited supply of consoles. And after launch, the system continued to struggle with sales, as it took 6 months for it to pass 1 million units sold. It appeared Sega was already feeling the heat of the competition, as even before the PlayStation 2's launch, Sony still had 60% of the gaming market, as the original PlayStation had still maintained a strong, dedicated install base that was still receiving a very strong selection of games. Sega was desperate to gain a lead before their competition could enter into the 6th generation, so they cut the price of the Dreamcast to just 19,900 yen in Japan, and then set their sights on making sure their Western launch would be a success, intending to launch at a lower price with a stronger selection of games on offer than what they had previously had at the Japanese launch. And when the Dreamcast came to the West on September 9th, 1999, this tactic proved successful, as Sega managed to sell over 225,000 units within 24 hours, and passing 1 million units sold by November 1999. Launching in Europe on October 14th, 1999, the Dreamcast performed well, selling 500,000 consoles by the end of the holiday season. Sega was fighting tooth and nail to make it through this generation, and had managed to make a decent impact by selling around 4.3 million units worldwide ahead of the PlayStation 2's launch. However, even though Sega's efforts were valiant, as the PS2's launch approached in Japan, there was a substantial buzz for the console building, as weeks before launch, the PlayStation website had crashed the minute that pre-orders had opened. Sony played into the public's overall hype and anticipation with a TV ad campaign that showed short scenes of people going about their daily life, counting down the days until the PlayStation 2's launch. And when March 4th, 2000 finally came around, the PlayStation would prove to be one of the biggest launches in history, with Sony selling out of their entire stock of around 1 million units in a single weekend. The excitement and demand was massive. According to a local Japanese newspaper, over 10,000 people queued across Tokyo on launch day, some of whom had started waiting up to 4 days earlier, and apparently across the internet, scalpers were shifting consoles for upwards of $2,000. Although, despite the massive demand, across the PS2's 11 launch titles in Japan, there weren't many games that people would consider a killer app or must-own title for the system yet, as at launch the games drawing people's attention was mainly Ridge Racer 5 and Kessen. However, the PlayStation 2 would get its first killer exclusive when Tekken Tag Tournament launched shortly after on March 30th, and it would go on to sell 400,000 copies in just 4 days of its release. Surprisingly, the PS2's successful launch was not due to its exclusive software. Its biggest draw for many were the console's other features, such as its backwards compatibility, and mainly its ability to play DVDs, as at the time DVD players were more expensive than the PS2 system itself. It was really successful from the start. The PS2 sold like crazy, but when it launched in Japan, the best-selling software was actually the Matrix DVD. DVD was catching on, but it was still a very expensive system, and the PS2 came out with the same high-quality DVD player capability with much lower, disruptive pricing. The initial launch was incredible, as by the end of March, Sony had sold out of their entire stock of 1.4 million consoles. But early on, Sony hit a snag in the road as their first round of PS2s shipped with a bug that had unintentionally given users the ability to bypass the system's region locking on the DVD player, so that they could play DVDs from foreign regions. Due to this, Sony could face legal actions if they didn't fix the situation, so Sony put out a recall for the utility disc that came packaged with the console that would install the firmware for DVD playback onto the PS2 memory card. So Sony asked for PlayStation 2 owners with the version 1.0 disc to send it back so that they could replace it with the updated version 1.01 disc that would fix the bug. To ensure as many people as possible updated their discs, Sony made the whole process completely free and even refunded the shipping cost to users. Additionally, it was even possible to replace the disc for free at 7-Eleven stores from April 7th until April 21st of 2000. To fully avoid this bug, the PlayStation 2's design was updated, so the software to play back DVDs was built into the motherboard itself. With the massive success that the PS2 was seeing in Japan, it seemed a sure bet that it would be a massive hit worldwide too. However, surprisingly, Sony would face restrictions on the overseas export of the console due to the Japanese military fearing that the Emotion Engine chip and the console's components were so advanced that they could be adapted to be used as missile guidance systems. However, eventually Sony was granted permission to ship the console internationally, excluding the countries Iran, Iraq, Libya, and North Korea. The fears of PlayStation 2s being used by terrorist groups also spread across to the US, where there was speculation that Saddam Hussein had stockpiled 4,000 PS2s with the intent to create a supercomputer. However, these claims were eventually dismissed, with a source close to the government intelligence service in the UK describing it as complete cobblers. While the concept seemed incredibly far-fetched, in 2003, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at the University of Illinois actually managed to create a supercomputer cluster comprised of 70 PlayStation 2s running Linux, and they used this cluster to run calculations on quantum chromodynamics, or CQD, simulations. As news spread of the PS2's great success in Japan, the excitement of Western Sony fans continued to grow, and at E3 2000 it would reach a fever pitch, as Kazuo Hirai announced that Sony planned to have 1 million consoles ready to launch in the US and Europe on the 26th of October 2000. And for the international release, they would be revising the PS2's design. However, this ultimately led to Sony having issues with manufacturing, as they had decided to change the size of their graphics synthesizer chip for the new console design, which led to them needing to upgrade its Nagasaki chip foundry from 0.2 micron technology to a 0.18 micron process, which slowed down the production greatly, so Sony would ultimately have to slash the number of consoles that they would have for the US launch by half, and also push the European launch back to November 24th. Sega saw Sony's delay in breaking into the West as a lifeline, as this was where they had their largest install base. So in a last-ditch effort to get ahead, Sega reduced the Dreamcast price yet again, down to just $150, which was half the price of the PlayStation 2, and also focused their efforts on creating sports games that appealed to the West, while the PS2's software offerings were still somewhat slim by comparison. Also, the console race was about to kick into high gear, as both the Nintendo GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox were gearing up to launch their systems in 2001. However, despite the competition, the demand for the PS2 was still massive, as their marketing continued to target older teens and young adults, just as they had with the PlayStation 1, while Nintendo and Sega had primarily focused on a younger audience. But PlayStation had carefully cultivated a brand image that felt more mature, edgy, and almost subversive, by sponsoring events that would appeal to the demographic, such as skateboarding, nightclub events, and music festivals, as well as ad campaigns that felt more modern and mature, as they featured avant-garde, striking visuals that strayed away from the conventional approach of marketing games consoles, as they rarely even showed gameplay and would instead lean into the surreal and unsettling, adopting a grungy but modern, almost subversive aesthetic. similar to films like Trainspotting and Fight Club. Sony even enlisted the surrealist director David Lynch to create a short marketing film called The Third Place, which features some incredibly striking, bizarre imagery that seems to portray the PS2 being a portal to another dimension. Sony's unconventional advertising appeared to work, as when the system finally launched in the US, it sold out immediately, launching with 29 different titles available, including a good number of sports titles that would draw the attention of the wider gaming audience. But due to Sony's manufacturing issues, they were struggling to keep up with demand, as when the console launched in Europe a month later, they could only send 165,000 consoles of the promised 200,000 to the UK, and in France, they only received 70,000 consoles. The demand was massive, and the supply was short, as frustrated fans struggled to acquire the PlayStation 2 over the holiday season. While Sega had hoped this would work in their favor, ultimately, the writing was on the wall, as even though they had an impressive selection of games, the demand just wasn't there for the Dreamcast console, so they decided to exit the hardware business in 2001, discontinuing manufacture of the Dreamcast console, instead focusing on continuing to release games for the console, and ultimately moving on to producing games for competing 6th-gen consoles too. The PlayStation 2, however, was going from strength to strength, slowly building a strong library of games, and selling 10 million consoles worldwide by March 23, 2001, just 1 year after its initial Japanese launch. However, competition was looming on the horizon, as Nintendo and Microsoft were preparing for launch, which both posed a significant threat, as Nintendo was a titan of the gaming industry with a dedicated fanbase and a prestigious legacy of iconic series, and Microsoft was no slouch either, as the PC gaming market was huge, and Microsoft's console promised to be an easy transition for PC developers into the mostly untapped console market. And while the PS2's architecture was innovative, it was still proving hard for developers to fully utilize the system, and both the GameCube and Xbox boasted higher specs than the PS2, and were much easier for developers to leverage the system's power, which led to some developers wanting to focus on producing software for the competition. Early on, Microsoft had managed to draw the next entry in the Oddworld series over to become a launch exclusive for the Xbox. Series director Lorne Lanning commented, "People used to say that Microsoft was stealing the exclusives. There's a certain truth to that. The PS2 got supercomputing capability into an affordable consumer electronic box, but the expense of that was that no one knew how to use it. The attitude was kind of, you'll figure it out." And Nintendo had also managed to leverage the support of Capcom, with a selection of exclusive titles, including many from the Resident Evil franchise, including a remake as well as a prequel, and ports of the mainline series, and also the newest entry in the series, Resident Evil 4. Initially, when the GameCube launched in Japan on September 14th, sales were slow, most likely due to the small selection of 3 games at launch. However, when the Xbox launched in the US on November 14th, it fared much better. Selling at the same price as the PS2, it managed to sell 1.5 million units by the end of year. And when the GameCube also launched just 3 days later in the US on November 18th, it managed to build more momentum, with sales supposedly outpacing the competition, selling an estimated 1 million units total. By the end of 2001, the competition was heating up, with the GameCube and Xbox still yet to release worldwide. However, they would still have a long way to go catching up to Sony, who had already sold a massive 25 million units worldwide, and now had some incredible titles available exclusively on the system, including Final Fantasy X, Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, Onimusha, and Grand Theft Auto 3. In 2002, the Xbox launched in Japan in February, and even though they had revised the controller to appeal more in the region, the console failed to connect with Japanese gamers, most likely due to Microsoft's first console launching at a higher price than the PlayStation 2, with a lack of exclusives that appealed to the Japanese audience. And out of the box, the ability to play DVDs was locked away behind a paywall. Later in the year, Xbox and GameCube also launched in Europe and saw strong sales. However, even after they reduced their price, they failed to surpass the PlayStation 2, who had sold almost 50 million consoles by the end of 2002, which vastly eclipsed the GameCube's 9.55 million and Xbox's 8 million sold. At this point, it was clear the PS2 had a dominant lead on the competition, and despite their best efforts, Nintendo and Microsoft knew that Sony were simply untouchable this generation. Despite its lack of accessibility for developers, Sony had done practically everything right, launching at the right time with an extensive list of features, being the only console of the generation to offer backwards compatibility and DVD playback straight out of the box, whereas with Xbox you would have to buy an accessory to unlock the feature, and the GameCube lacked any support for standard DVDs. The PlayStation 2 went from strength to strength, and Sony introduced a new version of the console in 2003, called the PSX, which took its name from the original provisional codename for the PlayStation 1. The PSX was designed to be the ultimate home entertainment unit, with a digital video recorder integrated with a PlayStation 2, as well as digital multimedia support. The console came with an integrated hard drive that could be used to record digital video, and also supported games that required the PlayStation 2 hard drive, such as Final Fantasy XI. Whilst initial sales were strong, its high cost resulted in poor sales later on, which led to Sony cancelling its plans to release the console outside of Japan. A new slimline version of the PlayStation 2 was also released in 2004, drastically reducing the size of the console and including a built-in Ethernet port. However, the console would no longer support the use of a hard drive, so the games that required it could not be played on the slim console. As time went on, the PS2 proliferated the entire cultural zeitgeist. With its mature and innovative approach to marketing, gaming had now gone to a level it never could have before. It seemed as though PlayStation was everywhere, and it was becoming continually more popular. Throughout the 6th generation, Sony had over half the home console market share. The PS2 was a phenomenon that vastly outlived the competition, having one of the longest lifespans of any console, as it would be produced for over 12 years, until the system was finally discontinued in 2013, and also would receive its final game on the 8th of November that same year. In terms of sales, the PS2 would not only surpass the competition and the record set by its predecessor, it would also become the highest selling console of all time, selling an absolutely incredible 160 million consoles worldwide, a record that still stands as of 2026. Sony had done it once again, and they had flipped the gaming industry on its head 2 generations in a row, with record-breaking sales. The PlayStation 2 was a mammoth success, and while its design and features helped to sell the console initially, ultimately a console is defined by its games. Initially, game developers struggled with the PlayStation 2's architecture, which led to games releasing at a much slower pace. But over time, the PlayStation 2 would build up an incredibly large catalogue of games, with over 4,200 different titles releasing for the system, which is an absolutely staggering amount compared to the competition, with the Xbox taking second place with 998 games released, and the GameCube taking third with 651 games released. And finally, the Dreamcast, with a surprising 620 games released. Just looking at the top 20 selling games for the PlayStation 2, you can see a strong, diverse selection of titles, many of which are highly regarded as influential titles that truly pushed the art form of gaming to a whole new level in terms of popularity and technical design. Grand Theft Auto was perhaps the series which had the biggest impact on not just the PlayStation 2, but the entire cultural zeitgeist of gaming, as the series saw an explosion in popularity with its third mainline title, GTA 3, which is an open-world game where players took control of a small-time criminal in the fictional Liberty City, in which players would have the freedom to freely explore the game's world. Grand Theft Auto 3 was a phenomenon, as it was a huge step forward for open-world games, as it offered up so much freedom to players, encouraging them to run amok in a realistic, interactive city. However, while the game quickly grew in popularity, it also drew lots of controversy, as many questioned if the game's content was appropriate for an interactive medium. As in the game, the player was able to steal cars, attack civilians, and could even, shall we say, solicit certain adult services from characters you might find on the corner of a high-crime area. This in particular would lead to the game being banned and recalled in Australia until the developers removed all instances of the adult services. However, this controversy didn't do anything to slow down sales, as Grand Theft Auto 3 became a massive success as it continued to sell at an incredible rate, becoming the 5th best-selling title on the PS2 with 11.6 million copies sold. But the series' success wouldn't end there, as just a year later, the developer Rockstar released GTA Vice City, which expanded upon the previous game, featuring an even more expansive and interactive world, now set in the 80s. The story was a notable improvement in depth, as the game would feature 4 times the amount of dialogue compared to GTA 3. Also, Rockstar even managed to cast actor Ray Liotta as the main character of the game, Tommy Vercetti. Vice City was again a massive success, and went on to become even more successful than its predecessor, becoming the 3rd best-selling title on the PS2, selling a massive 14.2 million copies. However, the series still had yet to reach its peak, as 2 years later, GTA San Andreas released, and further expanded upon its predecessors, now set in the largest map in the series so far. San Andreas offered the most freedom in a GTA game yet, allowing players to customize the main character CJ's appearance. Also, the player could alter his physical attributes through RPG-like stats, which could be changed depending on what the character eats and how much they exercise. San Andreas also managed to attract even more celebrity talent, including Samuel L. Jackson, James Woods, Peter Fonda, Danny Dyer, and David Cross to voice characters that would appear throughout the game's story. San Andreas was immensely popular, and it went on to become the top-selling game on the PlayStation 2 overall, selling an incredible 17.33 million units. The previously best-selling series on the PlayStation 1, Gran Turismo, continued on the PlayStation 2, and again offered up some of the most realistic and visually impressive racing games to date. With its realistic, simulation-style handling and incredibly highly detailed cars and tracks. While Gran Turismo 3 had significantly less cars than the previous game, the cars that were featured were the most detailed to date. Also, the jump in power of the PlayStation 2 allowed for more realistic physics and driver AI. The PlayStation 2 also received Gran Turismo 4, which continued to build upon GT3's foundation, offering what many consider to be the best game in the series, with over 720 cars on offer, as well as more events and modes. And on top of all of this content, the visual fidelity was on another level, and the game even supported HD TVs and could be played at a maximum resolution of 1080i via the PS2 component cables. The Gran Turismo series continued to be a massive success on the PlayStation 2, as both entries were top-selling exclusives on the platform, with Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec being the 2nd best-selling with 14.89 million units, and Gran Turismo 4 being the 4th, with 11.76 million sold. The Final Fantasy series would also continue to release its mainline entries on the PlayStation, as the duology of Final Fantasy X would be exclusive to the PlayStation 2. Final Fantasy X was the first game in the series to include fully 3D environments and also voice acting, and was seen as a massive step forward for the series in every way, in terms of its story, presentation, and its new conditional turn-based gameplay system, which allowed the player to switch out party members mid-battle. Final Fantasy X-2 was a direct sequel and carried on the story after the events of the previous game, whilst changing the gameplay to active time battles, where party members can switch class mid-battle. Both games released to critical acclaim, with 10 becoming the 7th best-selling game on the system, and X-2 becoming the 10th. Squaresoft was clearly not afraid to experiment with the Final Fantasy series, as they released Final Fantasy XI in 2002, which required the use of the network adapter and hard drive. As the game was an MMORPG, short for Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game, where players would be able to create their own custom characters and explore a fully online world filled with players. FF11 was incredibly ambitious and was actually the first MMORPG to feature cross-platform play between PlayStation 2 and PC, and has seen an incredible amount of support as the game received updates and expansions on PS2 until it was finally discontinued in March of 2016. However, the game is still live and supported on PC. The PS2 also received another mainline entry with Final Fantasy XII, which once again experimented with the gameplay, introducing the Active Dimension battle system, where instead of random encounters, enemies could be avoided or engaged in the open world, and battles would take place in real time on the map, rather than teleporting to a battle stage. Overall, the game saw widespread critical acclaim upon its release in 2006, and went on to sell 6 million copies, becoming the 9th best-selling game on the PS2. The PlayStation 2 also saw the start of a very renowned action RPG series with Kingdom Hearts, which features its own original characters and story that also combines the world of Final Fantasy and Disney. Kingdom Hearts released to critical acclaim, as many applauded its superb visuals, animation, voice acting, and musical score, as well as the ambitious combination of action and RPG genres. Kingdom Hearts went on to sell 5.9 million units, becoming the 10th best-selling title on the PS2. Also, a sequel released in 2005, which was generally well received, which went on to sell 4.75 million copies, becoming the 13th best-selling title on the PS2. Hideo Kojima continued to push the boundaries of gaming with the latest entry into the Metal Gear series, with Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, which was one of the first games that people felt truly showed the potential of the 6th generation. MGS2 was a landmark in gaming, which went on to become the 8th best-selling game on the system, and Kojima followed this up with Metal Gear Solid 3: Snake Eater, which was a prequel set 31 years before the events of the first Metal Gear game, which introduced survival mechanics into the series, where the player would not only have to avoid detection, but also have to manage their stamina by hunting and gathering food in the wild. And they would also have to tend to their wounds and afflictions to keep the player character Snake in good health. While Snake Eater didn't sell as much as Sons of Liberty, it still received universal acclaim, as both titles are highly regarded and considered to be some of the greatest games on the PS2, and arguably some of the greatest and most influential games in history. The Tekken series continued to release in arcades and exclusively on PlayStation 2, starting with Tekken Tag Tournament, which released close to the PS2's launch, and featured the largest roster in the series so far, with a massive 35 fighters. Also, this entry tweaked the gameplay to have tag mechanics, so players would select 2 characters and could switch in and out mid-fight. Tekken 4 released 2 years later and was Namco's attempt to evolve the series, as it had a more gritty, realistic tone, with 3D environments that featured obstacles and walls which could be used for extra damage. While the game visually was a massive leap forward, the gameplay changes proved quite controversial, as it led to slower movement and high damage cheap combos that would exploit the environment. However, both of these titles struggled to live up to the high expectations that had been set by Tekken 3. However, Tekken 5 would generally be seen as a massive return to form, as it focused on amplifying what people had liked about past entries, by making movement faster and more responsive. Also, the game included a very impressive roster, with 31 unique fighters, and even introduced character customization too. Tekken 5 was a huge hit and managed to revive the waning franchise, and was the 6th best-selling title on the PS2, with 9.43 million units sold. The PlayStation 2 would also see a number of new franchises start on the console, including God of War from Sony Santa Monica Studio, which is a hack-and-slash game with a story based on Greek mythology, where the player would take control of Kratos, a Spartan warrior who serves the gods, and is tasked by the goddess Athena to kill the god of war, Ares. The God of War series saw 2 entries released on the system, which both received massive acclaim, as both are often cited as some of the best games available for the PS2, and both sold over 4 million copies, becoming the 14th and 18th best-selling games on the system. The PS2 also managed to gain the appeal of a more casual audience, with a selection of party-style games that used unique peripherals so that they would be more accessible to non-gamers, with titles like Buzz, SingStar, Guitar Hero, and EyeToy. The EyeToy in particular was incredibly popular, which was a camera device that was capable of recognizing movements of the player, so players could interact with the game without the use of a controller. The EyeToy was a massive success, selling 10.5 million of the device, receiving 28 different games, and also some games that offered exclusive features that used the camera. The studio behind Crash Bandicoot, Naughty Dog, was purchased by Sony after the massive success of the Crash Bandicoot series on the original PlayStation. And for the PlayStation 2, they created a new series called Jak and Daxter, which was a very technically impressive platformer with more of a focus on story, which featured a fully seamless explorable world of interconnected levels with no loading screens between areas, as the developers wanted to break away from the linear approach of the level structure seen in the Crash Bandicoot series. When the first game released, it found critical success as well as strong sales, leading to the series getting 3 more games for the system and 1 spin-off racing game. One of Sony's first-party studios, Japan Studio, formed a small team known as Team Eco, headed up by Fumito Ueda, who would go on to create 2 incredibly influential titles for the PlayStation 2. Their first game was Eco, a puzzle platformer that focused on its unique, striking visual art style, world building, and immersive storytelling. While the game didn't achieve massive commercial success, it's often cited as one of the most influential titles on the system. The studio's second game, Shadow of the Colossus, was even more ambitious, and has the player exploring a vast open world, hunting down colossal creatures and slaying them. The game has been cited as one of the most influential to modern games, and its unique gameplay and sense of scale were truly inventive. And once again, the game was lauded for its incredibly immersive story, visuals, and a fantastic soundtrack, and served as a great example of how video games can be appreciated as an art form. While the PlayStation 2 may not have been the most powerful system of the 6th generation, it goes to show that raw processing power isn't everything, as the console's legacy is undeniable, as the sheer amount of games that were available was incredible, and many of which are held in incredibly high regards, as some of the most influential games of its generation. And in this video, we've only just scratched the surface of what games the system has to offer. With the PlayStation 2, Sony had done the impossible. They had created 2 consoles back to back that shook not just the games industry, but the entertainment world. The advancement in technology and the talent that learned how to use it led the entire medium of games forward, causing it to evolve to a whole new level, as the console absolutely decimated the competition in terms of sales and games released, with its sales records still standing today, and had the longest lifespan of any console to date. The PS2's influence was so widespread that the games industry was now seen as a competitor to the film industry. However, as technology advanced, the HD era of gaming was looming on the horizon, and the competition during the 7th generation of consoles would prove to be the fiercest yet, as Nintendo was planning to carve out a new direction in the industry, and Microsoft had gained a substantial foothold in the Western market, building up a strong selection of exclusive series, and building connections with many developers who had been disgruntled by the PlayStation 2's unorthodox architecture. But despite the issues that many developers had with the PlayStation 2, Ken Kutaragi and his team had a vision and felt that the PS2's Emotion Engine was just the beginning. As with their next console, they were planning to use an even more experimental architecture, building their system around a cell processor. And as the 7th generation loomed closer, concerns would begin to arise, as at launch, the console looked to be incredibly expensive and had a very sparse lineup of games, perhaps caused by the early reports of developers claiming it was even more difficult to develop for. While Ken Kutaragi's vision for the PlayStation 2 had been an immense success, questions were now beginning to arise whether the PlayStation 3 could be a step too far and could lead to PlayStation finally being dethroned.
If you're still here, thank you so much for watching. I want to say a truly heartfelt thank you to all of the Patreon and YouTube members. Your support helps to keep this channel going and creating more content. So your support truly means the world to me, and I can't thank you enough for everything. I also wanted to say some quick thank yous to some friends who have helped out along the way. First, thank you to Peter, who gave me this PS2, which has been a massive help throughout the project. I've used it to capture and film and everything, so thank you so much for that. And also thank you for helping with reviewing scripts and edits along the way, so you've been a massive help. He's developing his first game called Dark of the Depths, which is coming soon on Steam and is available now to wishlist, so check it out. Also, a huge shout out to my friend Chris, who made the 3D model of the PS2 for this video. He's an incredibly talented 3D artist, so check out his ArtStation to see some of his work. Also, thank you to Eugene Goat, who very kindly loaned me his PS2 Slim to film these shots, which I really think helped to up the production value of this video. So thank you so much for that, Eugene. You truly are the GOAT. Once again, thank you so much for supporting and watching the channel. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing for more. Liking, commenting, sharing, and hyping truly does help to grow the channel, so it would be massively appreciated. I know this video has been a long time coming, and I'm sorry about the wait, but I really have put everything I have into this project, working late nights after work and on the weekend. But I'm so proud of how everything's come together. I think it looks amazing, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. So thank you for your patience, and I hope you look forward to the next video. The next big project will be the complete history of Smash Ultimate, which is going to be an interesting one, as there's some rumblings about what's happening with the next Smash potentially. We'll look forward to see what that is, but I'm looking forward to covering Smash Ultimate. And hopefully that might lead into the next game if that's close, or maybe a review or something, who knows. Again, thanks so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.